All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our first panel on foresight in government. We have an interesting panel that is truly global. We have a representative from England. Should I say England, Europe, or England?
Welsh.
Welsh. From our host, UAE, from Singapore, and from Canada. I'm Eric Noël, and I'm an economist by training. You know what they say about economists. We are good with numbers, but we don't have enough social skills to be accountants. So I will try to avoid jokes and humor, and I will try to focus on expediting an exchange between smart people. We are hosted by His Excellency Abdulla Lootah, who's the Director General of the Prime Minister Office, United Arab Emirates, Mrs. Sophie Howe, who's the Commissioner for Future Generations, Wales, UK, and we have Jeanette Kwek
Jeanette Kwek will do.
Okay, Jeanette Kwek will do. She's the head of the Center for Strategic Futures, Prime Minister Office, Singapore. To start, it would be interesting to have the view of our host. We are welcome into a center, a hub of futurism, future of technology, future of longevity, energy, etc. And I would like His Excellency to say a few words about how you see what you're doing in foresight in government and how you want to have us think about Dubai and this perspective from the Emirates.
Well, thank you very much, Eric. And thank you for the organizers who brought us here together. Great minds, beautiful people coming together to discuss the importance of future foresight for all of us, not only government, but also private sector, as well as NGOs and people in general. Without foresight, I think we're risking our planet. We're risking our children and grandchildren prosperity and sustainability. With the UAE, there were some comments in the first session about government and future foresight. I would like to speak on behalf of the UAE government. I come from the Prime Minister's office. We work for the Cabinet, Ministry of Cabinet, and we report directly to the UAE Vice President, Prime Minister, and the ruler of Dubai. Dubai is about foresight. What we see, what we live, the way we operate is all about foresight. If you really think about this city in the Middle East, of course the UAE in general, but let's speak about this building and Dubai. 50 years ago, who would think that Dubai would have reached this stage of prosperity and advancement and development? Many people are under the impression that there is tons of oil and gas in Dubai. The contribution of oil and gas to the Dubai GDP is less than 1%. Less than 1%. Where does the 99% come from? Human capital. It's the brains, it's the people dreaming big. And future foresight is all about it dreaming. When we think about government, we think about betting on the future, creating a destination that is super, super far, and we say this is what we want to do. There is a methodology in future foresight called envisioning and backcasting. This is exactly the destination. I'll give you a very simple example. For those people who know DIFC, Dubai International Financial Center, I'm sure all the nationals and people living here, they know. But from outside, this is one of the best financial centers in the world when it comes to financial services, arbitration, and so on and so forth. The land where Dubai Financial Center is located today, if we think about the cost or the price of the square kilometer, it's one of the most expensive pieces of land on earth. That place was a parking lot for trucks. But we have His Highness Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid, bless him. He looked at this place and says, this could do better. We could do better with this land. And he said, let's create a financial center. What do you need? You need good UAE nationals and you need good brains from outside. Bring them together, create. He did bet on it, and it was a very calculated bet. There are tons of examples when we think about government, and I think the success, one of the main success factors for future foresight in government is actually having that particular culture and leadership. Trust in government is very important. When we say we're going to forecast, when we get future foresight, and we're going to forecast the country and how it's going to operate, we should never let the people down. According to the Edelman Trust Barometer Index, which is issued in collaboration with the World Economic Forum during Davos every year, the UAE comes second globally in trust in leadership and government. You lived in China, China comes number one. This is according to the people, the businesses. We commit, we deliver. Many people doubted Expo 2020, especially that it happened, we started and then the pandemic hit. People said it's going to fail. We said we're going to bring 20 million people to attend. The population of the UAE is 10 million. We need to double that amount. And of course, it's not going to, people will not come, all of them from the UAE. We reached a number more than 24 million people during the peak of the pandemic and all the different versions of the COVID-19. And this is, I think, where government earn the trust of the people, the experts, the partners, when we say, we're going to do future foresight together. Our event today is actually one of the tools for us as government. As Prime Minister's Office, Ministry of Cabinet Affairs, usually we don't talk about the work we do, but we leave it also for other partners who are here as well to speak, because they are the subject matter experts. They are the people that are dreaming big. We just sometimes we tone things with them. It's the business for all, engaging partners from different parts of the world in events like this. This is what makes things move faster and better for us.
Excellent. A lot of thoughts that will go back on when we start our exploration. Sophie, do you want to say a few words about the role of the Commissioner for Future Generations, please?
Yes, thank you. Wales is the only country in the world to have legislated to protect the interests of future generations through a law that was passed in our Senedd, our Welsh Parliament, in 2015, the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. What does it do? Well, put simply, it requires all of our public institutions at all levels of governance, from the very local, our local government institutions, our health institutions, right up to our government and specifically Welsh ministers, to demonstrate how when they're taking decisions, they're meeting today's needs without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. It also sets out 7 long-term well-being goals, and I think in the context of the discussion that we're having this week about foresighting, those long-term goals are critically important, because what is it that we're aiming for? The UAE have just set 10 principles for the next 50 years. So that's the aim, that's the goal, and you can work out then through foresighting, through scenarios, which are the important issues to take into account, which are the ones that are going to either hinder you reaching those 7, in our case, long-term goals, or 10 in the case of UAE, or which are the ones which actually you might want to adopt, and because they might accelerate your progress towards those set of long-term goals. And you wouldn't think it was revolutionary for a country to have a set of long-term goals, but actually it is quite revolutionary. There are very few countries across the world that have those long-term goals, not just set out perhaps in a political manifesto or a programme for government for the term of that government or of that parliament, but actually set out, in our case, in law, so they can't change from one election to the next. And that really requires then our politicians to work beyond electoral cycles. The other interesting thing then about the legislation, quite a brave move actually by the Welsh Government to appoint someone independent, that's me, to hold the government and others to account on how they're delivering in the interests of future generations. So my job is to be the guardian of the interests of the future generations of Wales, no pressure there or anything, but really it's to be the conscience, if you like, of the unborn and to keep posing the challenging questions of you're thinking about taking this decision, or you may not be taking that decision, you may not be acting fast enough in that area. How have you considered the needs and interests of future generations in doing that? And so our legislation requires some specific ways of working. It requires our institutions to demonstrate how they're considering the long-term impact of the things they do. It requires them to prevent problems from occurring or from getting worse. It requires them to integrate across government, so both in terms of co-creating a holistic vision for the future and a holistic set of steps to reach our long-term goals, recognizing that everything is connected to everything, so working beyond the silos of governmental departments, beyond the silos of the split between public, private, voluntary sector, NGOs, and so on, and collaborate with all of those organizations and all of those sectors, because finding solutions and steps that we can collectively take towards meeting those long-term goals is the best way of achieving them. And then finally, the principle of involving citizens, understanding the lived experiences of the people that we are here to serve, and involving them in co-creating solutions to enable us to meet our long-term goals as well. So 5 principles for decision-making, described by the minister who took the legislation through as the Common Sense Act. Why is it that we needed to legislate for common sense? Because you only have to look at the climate catastrophe that we're in, growing inequality in wealth, to conclude that common sense, sadly, isn't that common. So I would certainly advocate legislating for common sense and legislating to protect the interests of future generations. And if we've got some time later on, I can tell you about some of the impacts that legislation has had in Wales.
Thank you, Sophie. There is already a book named Good Ancestors. If you write a book, you could write The Guardians of the Good Ancestors.
Exactly.
That's your role.
Yeah.
Jeanette, can you say a few words about the Foresight, the Future Strategic Unit within the Prime Minister's office, which I visited a few times, and I was always impressed by the quality of not just the inside out, but also the outside in. I think I bumped into your colleagues in Japan, in the US, in France, in Germany. So you take a real global view of what Foresight is about.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for your compliments. I'm also very grateful for the invitation to be here today. It's great to be back in an in-person conference, so many old friends in the audience, and many new friends as well. So the Center for Strategic Futures, or the CSF, is really the latest manifestation of how the Singapore government has tried to institutionalize the practice of foresight in government and connect that to strategic decision-making. As you know, we've had a very long history of doing strategic foresight in the government, beginning with scenario planning all the way from the 1980s to today, where we continue to do scenario planning at the center, together with a whole bunch of other approaches to foresight that add to our toolkit to be prepared for the future. We're very lucky to work in an environment where our leadership recognizes that strategic foresight is, in fact, a critical capability for the public service. If you think about Singapore, it's a small country, very few natural resources beyond our people. We're a very young nation, and we have a very complex and very textured society. It is imperative that we have a good understanding of what our operating context looks like. What's changing out there and what's changing within our society. We have to pay attention to those changes in order to be prepared, to position ourselves, and to maybe adjust our operating model ahead of time if need be. You think about Singapore's operating model, it really operates on the flows of things. Goods and services, people, ideas, financial services, and so on and so forth. We have to anticipate changes in all of those areas, which necessitates us taking a global view of the world. And that's why the center exists. Partly to provoke conversations within government in response to all of these changes, but also to connect the government to all the wonderful ideas and the wonderful people out here in this external community doing foresight, so that we can have a broader perspective and see our own blind spots and look at the world through new lenses so that we can do things differently.
Thank you. From a consulting matrix perspective, I often think in terms of 2 by 2. So I have 4 dimensions: the why foresight, the how, the what, and the when. I think you've explored the why, and I feel like many authors that after the COVID crisis, where everybody was focused on the short term, we now need to quickly address the long-term issue. But Amy Webb earlier in her presentation was someone skeptical about the capacity of political leadership to listen and integrate and move on and act on what we're looking at in foresight. I would like to hear you about how do you make politicians and society listen to what you're doing?
Well, we certainly have the benefit in Wales that it's the law. that's a really good starting point. But I think it's also about recognising, where politicians and senior leaders are at and the influences that and the issues that are on their mind. And certainly, this was something that Amy was talking about. What is concerning them at the moment, and the fact that the entire system generally is stacked towards short-term concerns. So in a public sector context, performance measures tend to be short-term. The electorate tend to think in a short-term way and less encouraged to think beyond. There are constant crises to be dealing with, and governments and politicians are going to rise and fall often by how they deal with those crises. So I think it's about sometimes using techniques to look to the future, scenarios, foresight, but actually dock them back to how they might affect issues that are currently on the mind of politicians. And sometimes you can be finding the policy wins that are both good for current generations and have some real benefits to future generations. I think it's also about looking at things in a kind of holistic way. For example, it's clear that we have not yet won the argument in terms of the action that needs to be taken on climate. If we'd won that argument with all of the evidence that exists, we would be taking much greater action. But actually, in terms of pressing the buttons of some political leadership, the issue which plays more is actually these issues around social justice. Who are going to be the winners and losers in climate? So it might be that actually talking about your trends, scenarios, and foresighting approaches, which might be about climate, but docking that back into the things that actually matter to particular politicians is a better way of getting some of those things to fly. And then the final thing, I think I'll say, because I know we're short of time, is that you can have all of the evidence in the world, but unless you're able to communicate that evidence in an accessible way, link it back to current priorities, I think you're on a bit of a hiding to nothing until the entire world embraces perhaps some of the thought leadership that we're seeing from the government here, perhaps some of the thought leadership actually that many indigenous communities have embraced, these 7th generation principles. I think it's a real challenge, and we need to reform those governance mechanisms to ensure that there is that kind of requirement at all levels of government to be thinking to the long term and using evidence, therefore, in terms of foresight and scenarios to really encourage that.
Same for the how-to in Singapore. I know communication are simpler in a smaller country than in a very complicated, bureaucratic and large country. But you being within the Prime Minister's office, do you feel that being right there is why they listen to you more than other countries? Or?
For me or for
For
Jeanette?
both of you, because both
I
you
can
have
start,
your Foresight
if you
unit
don't
within
mind.
the PMO.
Okay. So I think you touched great points, Sophia, when you mentioned the co-creation and also the scenario planning. But there were a couple of points when you spoke about the short-term thinking and things like that. I think within the UAE, I would call it the UAE fabric. It's the way we do work is different from other nations, and every nation has its own modus operandi. For us, when we thought about creating the future, i.e. defining a destination, we were about to conclude the 50 years since the announcement of the UAE, and we said it's going to be over soon, 2021. What happens next? So their Highnesses, Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed, Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid, and their brothers decided to create something called the 2071 Centennial. Not many countries would think 50 years ahead. But how did we do it? We didn't bring consultants from abroad. There were some consultants, but there were experts, there were private sector, there were thought leaders, there were future insight experts, there were citizens, there were people, there were children in schools, there were patients, there were hospital doctors. More than 700 government employees were involved, but thousands of people were engaged in drawing and designing the Centennial 2071. This is how we operate, where we co-design and co-create our destination. Everyone, we call it, this is a shareholding company. And every one of us has one share. And when you have a share in any company, you have the right to design that company. You have the right to create that company. And this is our philosophy. Thinking ahead has proven that this is the right thing to do because it does, I wouldn't say it eliminates catastrophic events or disasters, but at least it eliminates the negative impact. The pandemic, when it happened, when we think about SARS in 2003, it was a huge thing, the media covered it, but it did not paralyze the world. There were cases of around 8,100 or so. But when we think about COVID-19, according to WHO, we have around 616 or 620 million COVID patients or people who got COVID. Now, the whole world was paralyzed for long times. But our education system, it did not stop because we had the e-learning ready. We have Dr. Mansour Al-Awar, one of the champions in e-learning. And actually, one of the success factors is to have champions and heroes who believe in the future. So we had the e-learning for the curriculum was ready from 2000. Many people said to their highnesses, why do you spend so much money on e-learning? It was a switch off, switch on. The same thing with the health services. Hospitals were there. The result was, according to Bloomberg, the UAE was ranked #1 in resilience when it came to COVID. So these are the kind of things where governments take some bold decisions, sometimes very expensive when it comes to financial impact, but very important to secure the what-if scenarios that we are talking about. Now, these are the kind of things where leadership is at the core of development. They're not outside, they're not far away, they're not thinking short-term and elections. They're thinking we're building a nation for hundreds of years to come. And we're building a nation not only for us, always His Highness, when we meet with him, His Highness Sheikh Mohammed, he says you're in the business of, and it's one statement, serving people. I'm a civil servant. I need to practice that 2 words, civil servant. It's about serving people. People as in private sector and people. What do they expect from me? They expect the best products and services from government. Unheard of. I'll give one last example from our side when he said, why hotels have star system? Why can't we have in government services offices a star system outside so that a top official like Dr. Mansour or myself or Marwan, we walk in and we see we're a 2-star or a 1-star or a 5-star if we're lucky. So all the government services offices in the UAE, if you walk into one, you will see a star system board. This is thinking ahead. This is future foresight when it comes to services. Sometimes we create services that does not exist today, and there is no demand for it today. But when we created it, we saw the appetite. And immediately, the supply created that demand in the UAE.
Yeah, I get that. Thank you very much. You gave the SARS example, and earlier Amy Webb was saying that Canada had a very strong foresight capacity. If there was a city that was truly affected by SARS, it was Toronto. Toronto had to kind of shut down itself when SARS happened because we had the first 2 deaths that were reported. So there was no more convention, no more shareholder meetings, very little attendance in theater. So we created in Canada in 2005 a global health intelligence system with staff that were reporting daily to authorities about emerging disease around the world. And well, there was some weak guidance, unfortunately, and in 2019 the government decided to shut down the Global Health Intelligence Network, and we had very little understanding of what was coming from China, even though before we had it. So there is a question of when that I've mentioned earlier, and the what. I think when we face crisis, we're all sometimes sitting ducks, but on the what, I'm sometimes puzzled by what we choose in terms of topics and subjects in foresight units and how we go about it. Maybe you could say a few words about how you select your topics.
I think it comes down to understanding your audience. Well, first of all, understanding who your audience is and what their current concerns are. And then looking at what we understand of the future in relation to those current concerns. That's what Sophie was saying. We have to dock it back to what our stakeholders are worried about today. And sometimes the future is just a safe space for us to talk about those current day challenges in ways that unlock action, right? Because we are talking about it in a theoretical future, it allows us to imagine responses that we might not otherwise have the space or time or courage to do. And so the scenarios, for example, are very much a way for us to think about the present differently in the guise of the future and perhaps act differently. I also wanted to say a couple of things about being part of the center of government and how that has helped us to move towards action. I think having the infrastructure to generate action, to be connected to the policy community more tightly is definitely beneficial. But infrastructure is not enough. It really is, do we have the tools, the products, and the people to communicate these ideas and to hold safe spaces for our leaders to have these difficult conversations, right? The power of good facilitation is one that I think we often forget. We imagine the trend reports and the scenarios speak for themselves, but frequently they do need someone to stand up and speak for them and to invite a conversation to happen around them and to push that conversation a little bit. Without that impetus, it's very difficult, I think, to generate action, no matter how good the report is, no matter how beautiful the scenarios are, no matter how wonderful your products are. Without that human to stand up and say, let's have a conversation about this. I think that's... Yes.
And Sophie, I know in your mandate, the what are the topics, they are specific, but when you look at the evolution of your role, have the topics changed over time, or will they stay about the same because of how you define future generations?
I think, so we're 7 years into the Future Generations Act. I'm the first commissioner. I'm just coming to the end of my term as commissioner, and I think at the beginning it was tough. We were having to do a lot of thinking. There was a lot of bureaucratic responses to enacting the legislation. You know, it's much easier to fall back on process than actually changing culture hearts and minds. But over the course of the last 7 years, and actually the pandemic was actually a pivotal moment in that, where we could both reflect back on how well have we sort of understood this risk and prepared for it, not very well at all, and actually what is the change in sort of dynamics of public perception, the old adage of never waste a good crisis, how can we build back better? And that, in line with the framework that our legislation requires in terms of this particular way of thinking, has actually really accelerated the cultural change, I believe, in Wales. So I'm now doing much, much less convincing of the need to, and much more practical how to. And I think that that's really encouraging in terms of seeing that cultural change over that period. Legislation at the beginning certainly helps to prompt that. It's not the only answer. There's still a big programme behind it, but having that legislation and that statutory requirement is certainly a good starting point.
There is a risk factor that Amy Webb mentioned before. You may know that story, but it's once there are three women who are together, it's a doctor, a lawyer, and a risk manager, and they are debating the merits of having or not having a lover outside of their wedding. So the doctor lady says, well, it's really bad to have a lover. It's stressful. It's bad for your art. The lawyer lady said, well, no, it's really good for my divorce practice, so I think it should have one. And the risk manager says, no, actually, you need both. You need a husband and a lover. Because when the husband thinks that you are with the lover, and when the lover thinks that you are with the husband, you can stay longer hours at night at the office and play with your risk models, And it's the risk manager era, I think, that we will see outside of the crisis. I went through 9/11 like you. It was a recruitment of risk managers for 2 or 3 years. After the financial crisis, it was recruitment of financial risk manager, and now it's health policy risk manager. I mean, it's either you are almost in the risk management camp or you're not there at all. While when we listen to you, His Excellency, there is much more optimism. It's much more about opportunities. And in that culture, I think we have something to learn from it. Not that risk management is not good, but in terms of opportunities management, I wonder how we could beef up the capacity of Foresight experts to position their clients, their audience, to those opportunities that are positive.
I think optimism comes with seeing opportunities. Sometimes it's so hard to see the opportunities. We hear about the challenges, the disasters, the catastrophic things that are taking place. But there are tons of beautiful things in the world that are taking place where we can collaborate and we do magical things. If we can invest a fraction of what we spend on things that are unnecessary, on research towards autism or research towards cancer, trust me, we would have found the solutions decades ago. But I think there are 4 things that I would like to focus on when it comes to how we operate in terms of future foresight in a positive way. One of them is the culture thing, where it's embedded, it's part of the way we operate, it's the part of how we behave, it's thinking about the positive things. The second one is about creating that structure. The structure could be an agency like the Prime Minister's office or the Executive Councils, and Asha is there, but there are tons of offices where they have future foresight embedded, whether clearly mentioned or there are champions and heroes. The third one is people, and this is when I spoke about Dr. Mansour establishing the very first e-university in the Middle East decades ago. Now, people think, why the UAE is launching an e-university? But Dr. Mansour and his team and the leadership saw something. They saw an opportunity. It was, of course, a vacuum. It was a gap, but they saw an opportunity for us. So people and champions to be celebrated is very important. And the last thing is process. And this is where I say future foresight should be cross-cutting all the government operations, all the systems in place. Future foresight has to be part of the way hospitals operate, how the schools are operating. When I meet my children every day at night time and they go to to a good school, I would say, that they speak about things that I did not speak about when I was in school. Now, my grandchildren will speak different from my children. So the things that are changing in the UAE and being a very cosmopolitan, a very inclusive society forces you in a positive way to have a wider horizon, to accept people. And when you accept people without judging us on the way we dress up, whether I'm wearing a kandura or the lady is wearing a hijab, abaya, there are local girls covered and there are girls that are not covered. There are some UAE nationals boys wearing trousers and jeans. It does not matter. As long as this thing functions and operates in a positive way, you're going to do magical stuff. So this is where we treat people based on intellects and goodness towards humanity. The whole world worked on something beautiful for nations that are deprived from the thought leadership and the expertise or the ability to hire, I'm sorry to say, expensive consultants. They created the Sustainable Development Goals, a roadmap for 2030. And it covers 17 goals: education, fighting poverty, no hunger, climate change, cross-country collaboration, peace and justice. If all countries just take the UN SDGs and put it as a destination, that's future foresight. As simple as this. It's written, it's there, it's documented. You don't need to do the 200 plus indicators. There are KPIs. Do 100 KPIs. You'll achieve a lot. Do 50 KPIs. People will feel the difference. At the end of the day, if people cannot feel the strategy of the government or the policies that governments are creating, the products of the government and so on and so forth, there is no need. If we can't translate it, if we can't humanize Vision 2071, if we cannot humanize a public policy, it's obsolete. There is no need.
It's somewhat visionary as well. You even have a date when Emiratis will be on Mars. I read it in 2117, you wish to have people on Mars. On the model that Wales has developed, I'm trying to see, are you able to think of similar countries where, I don't know, the Netherlands or Finland, etc., that can adopt something that was developed? Wales is what, 3.5 million people, something like that. So are we able to scale a model like yours about not just the protection of future generations, the thinking about what we do, is it as good ancestors? Would you see a global kind of replication of what you're doing?
Well, you're hearing from what I've heard described as a league of small and awesome nations on the panel here today, showing what the small countries can actually do and the really progressive approaches that can be taken. And I think, it is often easier in smaller countries. The connections are greater, the reach is greater. There's a more direct route to government and influencing and so on. But actually, I think what we've achieved in Wales is already being adopted elsewhere. So the Scottish Government is about to have its own legislation for future generations. Indeed, some aspects of the well-being approach of our legislation. I know Her Excellency Ahoud El Rumi is built into the wellbeing strategy here in the UAE. Most excitingly, I think the United Nations Secretary General has set out an intention in our common agenda, which says that he wants to follow, I suppose, this model at a UN level with the declaration for future generations at a UN level, the appointment of a UN special envoy for future generations, which I guess is the sort of UN equivalent of my role, and reforms to the UN's own governance infrastructure to embed the interests of future generations and futures thinking in that. So I think if you ever think that you're too small, you should perhaps look at what some of these League of Small and Awesome Nations are achieving and the way in which they're influencing policy on a global scale.
Well, from a timing perspective, ladies and gentlemen, we could be talking about the future forever until the future takes place. I'm reminded that we basically have 1 last minute. How do you see your own future, the future of what you're doing in the coming years?
For me, as simple as maybe I would say that the future is limitless, honestly. It's for us, all of us, to conquer. If we really remain positive and think positive, the opportunities are beyond millions, trillions of opportunities for all of us to do good things for ourselves and for the communities around us.
I'm excited. I mean, the future is, the possibilities are limitless, but I think as a practice, as a field, foresight is also evolving, and it's a continuous experiment on how we can better think about the future, better act on the future, and I'm excited to be part of this experiment with this community and with my colleagues in government.
Well, I think I'm still currently the world's only Future Generations Commissioner with statutory powers, but I think there are a lot of Futures friends here today, and so I suppose my vision for the future, where do I see things going, is that the people in this audience won't be trying to convince and persuade, but will be embedded in governance structure with legal powers, so that every country in the world is legally mandated and required to consider and act in the interests of future generations.
Excellent. Well, as this session was recorded by camera, I hope that in 50 years from now, when someone watched the video, they will think that we were right in thinking about that and being optimistic. Thank you very much, His Excellency, for your time, participation, and for hosting us. Thank you, Sophie, for coming from far away, like did also Jeanette. Thank you for your time. Thank you again, and we are moving on to the next session. Thank you very much, and have plenty full of ideas and forecasts coming out of the coming 2 days. Thank you.